welcome to the spring edition of Catching Up with Katy. We have a very engaging guest today. We have Katrina Hobbs-Everett, who has been on HC Media before in different capacities, but never on Catching Up with Katy. And I'm very honored that she was interested in being a guest on this program because we have a lot to talk about, and I'm certain it will be a jam-packed 30 minutes of discussion. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. There's a lot to cover, and in the past you've talked about your organization, which is POSE, and tell the public what that stands for and what types of work you're focused on.
Sure, so POSE is Power of Self-Education. Our mission is to empower individuals toward self-sustained social responsibility through education. And I know that's like a broad term, but what that means is that we help people to navigate through the perceived barriers that limit them from living full and thriving lives. We do advocacy work, we run a youth center, we do work with men looking to re-enter into from the system, or just navigate away from street life, gang addictions, things of that nature. And so all of our services are actually free. We don't charge for any of our services, and I don't think that's something that we advertise enough. I think, especially with our advocacy work, with special education and school reform, we don't charge for any of our services. So if anyone is in need of services, we do provide advocacy work. We do a lot around special education and community mobilizing, with the school to prison pipeline, social justice, and prison reform. Those are our topics kind of this year that we're focused on.
And you're here to be a resource for Haverhill residents.
Correct. We deal with the Merrimack Valley, but our base is in Haverhill. We're located right there on 409 Washington Street, in the Mount Washington neighborhood. So.
And then do you have volunteers that are also involved, or is it something that you require a lot of experience for people to become involved in to help work on POSE?
No, so we have a board of about 7 members. We have some new ones that just came on. But our volunteers, they range based on what events that we're doing and people's interest. So historically, our Christmas gifting event has been our largest volunteers, because who doesn't want to help out at Christmas time? So usually around there we have about 30 volunteers, but on a regular basis, 1 to 2, really low numbers of volunteers. And the experience really ranges from people who have their doctorates, their PhDs, to people who haven't graduated high school. So the experience, the schooling doesn't really matter. What matters is that people have a passion for whatever the topic is that's coming to the table, and that they're willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and hands-on get involved.
And so you put a lot of time into this initiative, right?
Yes. Yes.
One of the things that you wanted to talk about, and I want to provide enough time on the show, is what you focused on in terms of the school to prison pipeline. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So the school to prison pipeline is basically, it's a national term, right, where students have been funneled from the school system into DYS and continuing on into adult systems, into a life of crime, basically. And it starts really historically from the zero tolerance policies, where now we're not supposed to be nationally following those zero tolerance policies. We've realized that we kind of went overboard and we made a mistake where we made everything very harsh, right? And that ended up being actually detrimental to youth. And so when a youth goes in to DYS or to detention, that's usually how they enter into detention, they are they become twice less likely to graduate high school. And if they go before a judge, they become 4 times less likely to graduate high school. So these impacts are, they're severe, and I don't think it's an issue that locally a whole lot of people knew about before we started talking about it. And we are continually trying to raise awareness about the school to prison pipeline and how it impacts our communities.
So what you're seeing is a pattern where once that process starts, where a young person is interacting with DYS, then they're much more likely to drop out.
Yes, I mean, obviously there's other harmful effects such as gang involvement, drug addictions, the societal effects of what it costs, to house a detainee, and what that costs if they are even then further committed. Prevention is much cheaper than it is to provide services or hold youth, because often people think that youth get services when they're in detention, and they don't, because they've not yet been adjudicated. They don't receive any services while they're in that detention phase. I'm also part of the Essex County JDAI, that's Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative team. And so the goal there, it's actually through DYS, is to try to prevent youth from coming into the detention system because it is so harmful.
I'm interested to learn more about what point you're focused on in terms of how there's a path and there are steps to this situation, and there's as early as elementary school
Yes.
in terms of preventative measures. Is your initiative focused on the prevention aspect of it, the operation of DYS and that interface between the schools and DYS at that point, or is it a little bit of everything?
It's a little bit of everything. That's why it's so difficult to try to pinpoint to describe what POSE does. We specialize in filling service gaps. So we believe in hitting it from all sides. We work with fathers and families to try to hit it from the in-home side, the community to provide activities for youth, positive alternatives, also raising awareness in the community about what the situations are, policy reform, legislation, anything that we can do to try to change what has occurred and try to save these youth, because that's our next generation. That's, everything that's coming up the pike is in Haverhill, our predominant population is youth. And so addressing them at all different levels, covering the issue at all different levels is where we see ourselves. One of the areas that we work most on, I guess, would be not just the community mobilizing where we raise awareness, but also working directly with the parents and with the youth to try to tell them what their rights are, educate them on what their rights are, and working with the state, because this is an issue, and I was on a conference call today with DESE, Department of Early and Secondary Education, and they were talking about how difficult it is for them to follow up when parents are actually not reporting the way that policies are being followed. They can't do anything to implement policy, but only on how the policy has been carried out, so specific cases. The policy, that goes down to school committee, that goes down to the superintendent, and how those are constructed and written. But as far as following the policies and whether or not our school discipline policies, the school code of conduct, those things are how we, at the local level, end up seeing kids going into the school to prison pipeline.
So at the policy level statewide, where there are particular laws on the books and then there are regulations that DESE tries to draft, are you satisfied with the state of the policy, and your concern is the lack of appropriate implementation, or do you have concerns with the policies as well?
I believe the policies are a step forward. Massachusetts has, I'm sure if you know, under Chapter 222 kind of led as far as, school discipline reform. And so I'm pleased to see the types of things that are addressed in there. Would I like to see it go further? Yes, of course. But I first would like all districts to be caught up to that level, which currently Haverhill is not caught up to that level. So that's been a main focus of my concern locally, is getting us up to speed to at least the state level of where things are.
And maybe for the sake of the audience, in terms of that law, could you break that down a little bit in terms of how it was before and how it's supposed to be now in terms of a district's reaction to disciplinary situations?
Well, I'm no lawyer, but
okay.
What I can give is my understanding of it. And so I think the things that are most important under the changes of what came under Chapter 222 is first, that youth who have been suspended or removed having access to their education still. They are entitled to their education still. However that comes to be, you can't just suspend a student for 10 days and not give them any substitute work. And so that, I feel like, is important. The other part of it is very specific things that should happen before youth is suspended. We should be doing alternatives to try to prevent that suspension. We should be doing, mediation, or I'm a big advocate of restorative justice. So some approaches that we can do to try to minimize the situation before it gets to the level of having to be a suspension. Suspension hearings, which we hear complaints so often that don't happen locally. It tells you your legal rights that should be happening. There should be suspension hearings where the youth is actually able to call witness regarding the situation that happened. Special education, that has a more in-depth track to it, although that's kind of included under this as well. a lot of people don't know that if there's 10 days or more cumulatively in that year of a suspension, that you can actually file a complaint, that shouldn't be happening, that's too much. And so that's any kid, that's not just special education students, which I just recently learned when, I'm going to forget the name of the lawyers that came out and did the program, but we had 2 different law firms come and do a Know Your Rights night. I wish every parent in the city of Haverhill was in that room, but they weren't. So we're still trying to relay that information. I'm trying to think of what else under Chapter 222 was a shift. The amount of days that a student could be suspended out of school, I believe it goes up to like 59. It shouldn't go, or maybe it's 59 or 93, and it can't go beyond that. There's like 58 different points. We were fortunate enough to have Harvard do a comprehensive review of the Haverhill School Code of Conduct to see if it matched up with Chapter 222 standards. And so I can't remember all that whole list.
Sure.
It was like a spreadsheet, but
Overall, what was the outcome of that study?
you mean what happened locally?
Well, if Harvard did that analysis and they compared the code of conduct to the law, what was the conclusion?
So what Haverhill was 89% out of compliance with, 98% out of compliance on the high school level, and on the K through 8 level, I believe we were, I don't want to misquote, but I believe
I
we
won't
were.
hold you to it, but approximately.
I think we were somewhere around 78% out of compliance.
78? Okay.
So we were, their words overall were Haverhill was largely out of compliance with Mass state law and DESE's expectations regarding our school discipline reform. We have not done a comprehensive reform on our school discipline codes since, I believe, 2012, and this law enacted in 2014. So,
I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, because you're so focused on this issue, the issue of bullying, which has become so widespread, and it's hard to tell between, is it the chicken or the egg, because we have social media and all of these outside pressures that are on our kids that might not have existed before. If they did, it was more isolated and not this instantaneous and sometimes anonymous communication that can happen now. What do you think about how it may be very often that bullying very quickly escalates because it goes on for too long? And what can be done to help remedy that?
I see those as linked. I really do, because bullying so often locally is not really handled appropriately. We have a pretty sound, I would say, policy regarding how things should go if a student has been bullied and that bullying is reported. Unfortunately, the follow-through just isn't there. And even when you sometimes seek legal help, there isn't enough teeth to that policy on a state level for it to really go forward as a case. And I feel like that's unfortunate. That's something I've actually personally experienced with one of my own children. And that's what the lawyer said. She said, I'm sorry, there's just not enough teeth for this to move forward. And I thought, well, this is crazy. We have a policy here that we can't even enforce, the expectations of how it should be implemented. And at this point, I do feel at certain schools, it's really just gotten out of control, that there's a culture of violence. And if that doesn't get addressed with our growing population of high-need students, this is going to continue to be a major issue.
So that's an instance where the state law needs to be strengthened so that parents have the recourse when they do discover that's happening?
Yes. That was even across the board. That was one of the questions that kind of came up in today's call with DESE, was saying it's very difficult when you advocate for parents to try to encourage parents to do the filing, to follow through. So much emphasis is placed on the ownership of what the parent needs to do to try to get their needs met, when so often they don't even know what is legal and what is illegal to even advocate for themselves and for their youth. But then beyond that, you go through the web of the bureaucracy of dealing with hierarchy. And they, because I find oftentimes that's because of trauma on the parents' part at some point in their youth, right? Where they become discouraged and they don't want to continue on with the stress of trying to fight for what is right for their student. And so one of the lawyers asked DESE, is there anything that can be done to help us leverage getting a response to these parents? And, mobilizing was the answer, and that's something I've heard reoccurringly for the past 3 years. The parents need to actually come together, and we've seen that in society when parents come together and they take a stand for what they believe is right, things do change. My difficulty with this particular topic is the demographic of parents which are most targeted for things of this nature, and the lack of venues for allies to come to the rallying call to be able to help. So that's another area that we're focusing on now.
Do you have ideas on how to improve parents' access to information?
First, I think trust is important. So often when we do events, because the trust has been breached with people in positions of power, it's very difficult to get the parents in the room. And so that's a slow process. I think that things should be available on the internet. So oftentimes when we bring up issues that are not on our school website, all of a sudden overnight they appear. And I think that's great because at least they appear, but that information should be readily available to parents. It should be bilingual. Communications, for example, should be bilingual. When you're emailing a parent or sending a note home or even making a call, we lack the capacity of bilingual staffing to be able to make those communications with the parents, to know that the parents are getting even informed consent, to be honest. And so I feel like that's a major issue as well.
And so when we talk about it being a confusing process, perhaps the law isn't keeping up with the on-the-ground needs for parents and for students. What do you see once that child is getting older and moving on through the grades and these difficulties are compounding? They're not going to get any better if they're not addressed. What do you see happening at the high school level with some of these young people?
By the high school level, I'll be honest, it's a mess. If you look at our dropout rates, and I've been kind of championing the fact that these are correlated, the school to prison pipeline and our dropout rates and our graduation rates, our school discipline, the bullying, all of that is intertwined. You can't really look at just one segregated. You have to look at it all together. And so at the high school level, by then, the youth and the parent are typically so exhausted that our highest dropout rates in the city of Haverhill are in 9th grade. That to me, we failed, right? When we can't effectively transition middle schoolers into high school, what is the hopes of college for competition, for entrepreneurship, right? I feel like that's somehow we've lost them. We've done a disservice. And one of the things that I've noticed is the programs that we implement at the high school level, while they're great programs, they are not being utilized and accessed by all youth. And the youth that I would say need it most are especially not doing those programs. So we have to find ways to catch those youth. When we have 17-year-old sophomores, we have to figure out a way to get that youth through, as opposed to them being, a year away from adulthood and realizing, I'm in 10th grade, I'm gonna have to just drop out and get a job because that's probably the best of what I can do. And their family saying, yeah, because it's difficult.
Do you have ideas as to why, at that point, that young person who would really benefit from those programs isn't connecting and accessing the programs?
There is and I don't want to pick on people, but for those particular youth, they feel very marginalized. There's a lack of caring adults in the schools to be able to support them. Even if you look at residential, we've got a lot of residentials in Haverhill and really in Essex County.
When you say residentials, what do you mean for the audience in case they don't know the terminology?
So these are group homes, residential group homes, where a youth has been committed to either DYS or DCF, like committed to DYS, and I guess we don't call them chins anymore, but where they have kind of dual guardianship with the state. The youth becomes a ward of the state, essentially. And so they are placed in these group homes. Now that system has changed over time, where we used to have res ed programs that were more long-term, and now we have mostly STAR programs, which are short-term, supposedly intensive systems of care. and they're not. They're failing. That's a whole other issue. But this does impact our youth at schools because they go away, let's say, because there's difficulty in the home or the youth has behavioral issues or whatever the case may be. They enter into a therapeutic environment where they are supported by staff to the best of their ability, right? If they take advantage of that, there's therapy groups, there's structured days, there's counseling, there's processing. And then they return into a home, into a community, into schools where we're not doing that, where we're not processing. You had an issue with this one, we're gonna pull together and we're gonna work through this. None of that is communicated. So that impacts trust, that impacts hope, and the youth's ability to be able to sustain and, grow. So we lack that in our schools,
So
even from the elementary level.
That makes sense. Do you feel like when it comes to family supports, there are going to be many different reasons why at home there may be vulnerability for that young person, whether it is a language barrier sometimes between the parent and the district where there's that disadvantage, or there's a situation that does involve DCF. I mean, there's many different reasons why, right?
Yeah. Our kids are carrying tons of baggage. Food insecurities, domestic violence, drug use in the homes, drug use amongst themselves, gang violence. It depends on, the youth, but there's a depression, anxiety, social media. I'm so glad that didn't exist when I was a teenager. That pressure, to present a certain image or to be a certain way is much more extreme. And I feel like there's a disconnect, right, between conflict resolution and processing and social, I don't know what the word is there, but life skills. Not just how to make your bed, but how to not get in a fight with somebody because they liked your girlfriend's Facebook picture. It's a different generation, and I don't feel like we've caught up to speed with where they are to be able to educate them properly, to prepare them for colleges or entrepreneurship, and to engage them in an academic setting. We're still trying to fit squares into circles, and if you don't fit that mold, which is an old mold, it's outdated, then you don't belong in the school system.
I'll bring up one of my pet peeves, only because I do think it relates in the sense that there's only so much time in a school day for what can happen for education, and I'm a strong believer that there's too much focus on standardized testing and trying to force a child, whether they have a physical disability, no matter what, English as a second language, they're going to spend their time getting that score as high as possible in order to achieve success. So I think that as well is problematic, because I feel strongly that from when we were going to school, that love of learning isn't a big a focus as it used to be, where if you had different strengths, maybe it wasn't writing a paragraph or filling in a bubble, but it was art, or it was music, or it was poetry. You had the space to do that and experience that, and it's becoming more and more limited in terms of what happens between the beginning of school and when you go home.
That's one of the things that I miss about residential education schools, is because they were a different method of teaching, where they allowed the creativity and the hope of the youth to kind of transform and evolve into what they learned. I am not a fan of standardized testing. The mayor put up, Mayor Ferrantini, I think yesterday or the day before, that Haverhill had high SAT scores compared to other cities. And I thought, that's great if they could graduate high school with just passing the SATs. But we can't. You have to pass the MCAS or the MAP or the PARC or whatever the standardized test is that we're going to choose to use before you can graduate. And then that test doesn't get you access into college. They don't care about that. They're not doing Common Core. And so our kids come out underprepared.
And we also know that the cost of living is very high. So in terms of what their plans are going to be post either dropping out or with just a high school diploma, the odds are against young people if they're going to survive in the economy that we live in today as well. Given that the safety nets are in distress with state budgets And everything, I think, is in somewhat dire straits right now in terms of how, when you look at the potential in a young person, there are all of these pressures and, like you said, baggage and trauma. And you're working really hard to try to sort some of that out. And this is something that affects Haverhill, but it's statewide, really.
Yes, and you see changes happening in other areas. One of the things that I'm an advocate for is for community school models, where, yes, our kids are bringing in a lot of baggage, but how can our schools adjust to be able to meet those varying needs? You can't just push it onto the home, because some homes don't have that capacity. Mm-hmm. And I know that that all can't be done in a school day, and so I am an advocate for extended day. Mm-hmm. You know, I think that if that's compensated with services in the appropriate way, and the teachers are taught and trained, because this isn't a lack of I think, you know, this is not a malice. I think it's a lack of training to be geared to to be trained towards the type of students that we have today, mm-hmm. and the type of trauma that they're dealing with today. I feel like that's a lack. That professional development in general is an area where we in Haverhill struggle, and this takes experience. It's not something you can just pick up in a book. You need kind of the longevity to pull out that potential in those youth.
Well, two quick things, and even though we only have a few minutes left, I'd love to ask you, with that exact point, another challenge is with standardized testing, I think it becomes harder to have that longevity in the teaching profession when people get burned out because they're teaching to the test. And some of the things you're talking about in terms of working with children and understanding that diverse complexity of issues for that whole child, which starts before they come to school and happens after they leave school, is a complicated thing. So I guess my last question for you is, do you feel that the supports need to go beyond the teacher? Is it, you know, what I think of as the outdated notion of a guidance counselor? You know, where are these supports going to come from when ideally the teacher is there to instruct and teach that student to read and arithmetic and social studies, you know, and all those things? Where in the school, in terms of infrastructure and offices, or who are those people really that are going to be doing that challenging work in your mind?
They don't exist yet, right?
Okay.
I feel like in here we don't have them in our schools yet, because guidance counselors have turned into college coaches. Okay. And school resource officers have largely turned into gateways into the school to prison pipelines. And so I don't feel like those relationships currently exist. I know that it's no secret that the demographic is also different between who we hire and our student population. And so I think that service providers, a lot of people think social workers or police. Both of those are intimidating titles to families. Mm-hmm. So I don't necessarily think that that's the answer. Mm-hmm. I do think that parents and students need to be involved in the process of trying to create what the community school should look like, and how that could, you know, really, I think, change any town, any neighborhood. Because if you have good schools, that changes the core of everything.
I think that's a great note to end on. I cannot believe that we ran out of time, because we've just gotten started on this discussion. But promise me that you'll come back on the show and we'll pick it right up.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I've learned a lot. Thank you. And thank you to the audience for taking the time to watch this episode of Catching Up with Katy. We'll be back, I'm sure, with a second edition with Katrina Hobbs-Everett. Thank you for being on the show.